What are some highlight moments, obviously that, when you talk about playing the Opry the first time, along the way in your career to this point where you just turned 75, you were at the Opry?
Near death in 1980, with just 1 penny in his pocket, a renowned country music musician was found on the side of a Nashville highway. Someone overheard him talking to himself. Not even 2 years later would he release the greatest country song of all time. Here is the tragic tale of country music's hero, George Jones. Before he became famous all around the globe, he performed in Texas dive bars for tips. If we want to know where the most iconic country singer got his start, we have to go back to a modest wooden house in Beaumont, Texas, where a boy's voice was unknowingly molded by an abusive father. Then we will be able to understand how that noise on that cold road was created. George Glenn Jones endured the depths of America's economic collapse as a child born into poverty in a small log cabin during the Great Depression. While working as a truck driver and pipe fitter, George's dad would sometimes become drunk on the job and force George to sing for him, threatening punishment if he refused. The singing lessons were not fun, but they did have one redeeming quality. When George was a little boy, his sister would smuggle quarters into his performances, teaching him that music might be a haven and a way to redeem himself. George would spend countless hours as a child engrossed in the family radio, studying Hank Williams's yodeling techniques and committing Roy Acuff's tunes to memory. Even though his drunken father occasionally interrupted the ceremonies, he started performing in front of the local church when he was 7 years old. The family's main source of income came from the congregation's compassionate gifts, and George internalized a complex relationship between music, booze, and survival. At the tender age of 9, George started performing guitar and begging for money on Beaumont streets. A Saturday morning spot on CCK, a local radio station, was his launchpad. He received his first taste of professional performance, notwithstanding the meager $2 he earned. According to the station manager's logbook, the child has a voice that is too large for his body and sounds as old as 40. At the age of 4, George ran away from home and began performing on the streets and doing odd jobs. He seemed destined to follow in his father's footsteps after marrying Dorothy Bonvillian at 17 years of age. They had a daughter. But things turned out differently because of the Marine Corps. While serving in California, he became aware of the emerging honky-tonk craze. The music had transformed into a story. When George returned to Texas in 1953, he got a job at KTRM Radio, where he met the famous producer Pappy Daly. In spite of his imperfections, Daly saw the extraordinary talent in the little child with a powerful voice. Daly would remark, "He lived inside the songs." This led to George's first record deal in 1954, while he was recording for Starred Records in the back room of a rural radio station. Concurrently, his marriage to Dorothy fell apart due to his relentless pub gigs and growing ambition. George drank excessively and loved music as he was developing his distinctive voice and bad habits. He would often show up drunk to recording sessions, but for some reason, the alcohol just made his voice sound worse. After that came White Lightning. In 1959, a historic recording session occurred. 83 takes spaced out over 2 days, driven by determination and whiskey. Just when Mercury Records were about to give up, George got it right on his final attempt. The song's meteoric rise to fame catapulted George Jones from relative obscurity in Texas to stardom in country music. Both he and Shirley Corley, whom he had married at the time, were present as they saw his career soar. His conical nose and narrow eye sockets earned him the nickname the Possum among his colleagues. Even while he first disliked being remembered, he eventually came to accept it as better than being forgotten, regardless of the reasons why. Early 1960s songs like The Window Up Above, Tender Years, and She Thinks I Still Care showcased his growing command of the cry break, a vocal hook that could evoke bodily pain in listeners. But out of the limelight, George was honing yet another talent, getting through the day while drunk. The year 1968 was a turning point. Along with George's meteoric rise to fame because to singles like Walk Through This World With Me, a Mississippi hairdresser-turned-singer named Tammy Wynette was changing his life. Even though they didn't know it at the time, their meeting would set in motion the most epic love story in country music. It was in the lobby of a Nashville recording studio that George Jones initially laid eyes on Tammy Wynette that year. Both of their careers in country music were booming, but he had no competition. The energy in the room was electric, despite the fact that they began by discussing songwriting. She seemed to have come straight from heaven, George thought to himself after the fact. Only their married status acted as a hurdle. Their connection was immediate and strong. On their first tour together, George would intentionally perform Tammy's songs off-key so she would laugh. Backstage, they began writing songs about it as their emotions grew. Secretly, they were falling in love at honky-tonks throughout America after shows, unaware of it. As far as country music was concerned, the media proclaimed them President and First Lady. When news of their affair spread, it caused a rift in Nashville. Porter Wagoner publicly condemned Loretta Lynn and Tammy, although Lynn herself stood by her. Their splits caused a media frenzy that resulted in millions of copies sold in a matter of months. Their live broadcast of their wedding ceremony on country radio in 1969 attracted more listeners than any presidential speech that year. When they were first starting out as a couple, they were all the rage with hits about couples fighting to keep their marriages together. The video footage of them singing Take Me was shot while they were still married to other people. What you hear isn't just great singing, but real unfiltered yearning. Being Nashville's first power couple, they earned almost $500,000 annually from touring. There was indeed a dark side to affluence. George was unable to control his drinking. He became known as No-Show Jones because to his many concert cancellations, and the organizers began promoting tickets with the phrase, "Money back if George is sober." Tammy often discovered him in bars instead of on stage. On a particular night in Alabama, she even stole his car keys. George rode a lawnmower 8 miles to the beer shop. It was the decision that would define him. It was after the incident became national news that his audience members started playing with lawnmowers. Their routines take on the rhythm of a country song. George went into a paranoid spiral after combining his newfound cocaine with alcohol. When he thought Tammy was plotting to betray him with Porter Wagoner, he pulled a phone off the wall and accused her of conspiracy. His shooting rampage within their mansion lasted 3 days until he cornered her, at which point she broke down in sobs. Their daughter Georgette attempted to mediate, although she did so grudgingly. At 5 years old, she hid the empty vodka bottles from her younger sister Tammy, who had found them in their father's guitar bag. The offspring of their previous marriages even banded together, depending on which parent was the more steady one at any given time. A more sorrowful tone emerged in their duets as their marriage crumbled. The events of Golden Ring, which started in a pawn shop and escalated through marriage and divorce, were based on the true story of a wedding ring. Billy Sherrill, the producer, had to separate them between takes since their arguments during recording were more intense than the song itself. Tammy filed for a divorce from George in 1975, but he stubbornly resisted. He would sneak back into her house at all hours, singing her their old melodies, even if it meant climbing a window on the upper floor. He once discovered her performing at the Grand Ole Opry, all alone. Their voices sounded too beautiful together, even if the business tried to keep them apart. Following the split, their duets attracted audiences more than any of their united performances. While performing Near You at the 1976 CMA Awards, two lovers who were still in love with each other brought the house down with their lyrics about being near, always near you. In spite of George's rapid decline, Tammy remarried twice. He sipped vodka and had imaginary brunch conversations with his friends. He went on and performed at a 1979 performance while claiming he could only do it by adopting a Donald Duck accent. His drinking buddies, record label, and performance promoters all began to shun him. Tammy continued to have faith in him even when he was at his lowest. After finding him on that Nashville roadway in 1980, the police immediately phoned her. He was nearly frozen to death. He had just 1 cent remaining and was comatose. She dried him out and took him in as a last-ditch effort to save the man she praised as the best voice in country music. When Tammy left for the last time, George Jones began a descent into a pit that would make his previous fights look like a stage rehearsal. The Nashville country music king was about to be given a new name that no one wanted to be connected with, and he was about to become a cautionary story. George Jones was playing his hit songs in a parked Cadillac outside a Nashville liquor store in 1980 for $5. From $10,000 to vodka bottles and pence, the man's performance had plummeted. It was George Jones who found the base of the rock. He was now considered a joke in his industry. In a game they dubbed Guess Where George Isn't, the radio host publicized George's scheduled appearances, knowing full well that he would never actually show up. On average, he would only stay on stage for around 15 minutes before nodding off or getting up to grab a drink. Thus, he only made it to 39 of the 54 concerts that year. Plus, insurance policies against his no-shows were making promoters more money than ticket sales. Voice acting as Donald Duck catapulted him to stardom. During that period, he would imitate the cartoon character's voice and sing in an attempt to drive off evil spirits. After doing a whole act as Donald Duck at an event in Kansas City, he got into a fistfight with his reflection in the dressing room mirror. Whenever Jones became completely divorced from reality, his band began referring to those times as Donald Dark Moments. Pappy Daly, Jones's manager, made every effort to intervene. In order to get away from his hired bodyguards, George proved he was the one inebriated by injecting oranges with vodka and hiding bottles in toilet tanks. Vegas bookmakers began accepting wagers from fans as word spread about which venue would get the no-show. Every night he had 2 bookings, with the expectation that he would be able to attend one. Nevertheless, the strategy was unsuccessful. Cocaine made things worse. When he started seeing specters in his band, he ultimately dismissed the whole rhythm section for making nonsensical small talk with them. His suspicion that the members of his band were imposters, dispatched by rival vocalists, led him to issue a directive that they all wear name tags. He traveled his tour bus non-stop for 3 days in a row, convinced that Merle Haggard had hired ninjas to steal his voice, until his paranoia finally broke. He became notoriously bad at recording. His previous 4-hour studio session panned the single "He Stopped Loving Her Today," which he said was too gloomy and would never sell. The producer, Billy Sherrill, had promised to incorporate upbeat horns into the mix. He had no intention of keeping this promise, but it served as inspiration to finish. Even in that short time, he managed to alienate 3 additional producers. Following his time as king, he was seen more by the business community as a cautionary tale. Award shows made sure he sat in the back, away from the cameras, and he had to be sober to sing at the Grand Ole Opry. He also had to arrive 4 hours early. At 3 in the morning, he made his way to Johnny Paycheck's place. Insisted on performing a duet with Johnny's dog, whom he compared to a reincarnation of Hank Williams. After that, even his drinking buddies began to shun him. Everything in his personal life was a total bust. He would contact Tammy Wynette late as night, singing their old duets into her answering machine. His children stopped coming since he was too drunk to drive his youngest daughter home from a restaurant when she was 7 years old. George was compelled to alter his son's phone number after he persisted on calling his old suits stashed in the closet in an attempt to apologize. The financial crisis followed the musical calamity in a flash. He declared bankruptcy in 1980. They stole his house, car, and gold records. The price of George Jones memorabilia hit a new low when a pawn shop sold a blazer that Jones had worn to the CMA Awards for $12. A shrinking number of his friends were willing to put themselves in danger by letting him sleep on their couches. The subsequent event was that brisk nighttime drive through Nashville. Cops saw him talking to trees, so he had to stifle his once famous voice. He had a creased picture of himself years ago when he accepted a CMA award stowed in his pocket. Finding him was like finding a monarch in one's trousers, according to the police officer who made the discovery. The headline of the Nashville Banner read, "The Possum's Last Stand." In order to get out of a hole, you have to go down. Charles Ciotto was approached by a CBS producer following George's humiliating misstep on television. She had dealt with difficult performances before, but nothing had prepared her for George Jones in 1981. When Nancy entered a sleazy Nashville tavern, she saw a broken legend named George, who was everything but the rebellious dude she had imagined. "I thought I was meeting the monster of country music," she stated when questioned about her uncertainty. "Right, instead, I met a man whose only remaining sense is his voice." Their first meeting lasted 6 hours. No more Donald Duck impressions, no more rescheduled shows, and no more justifications, Nancy said. In his vodka-hazed vision, George beheld someone he hadn't seen in years, someone who wasn't afraid to tell him no. By the end of the night, he had already decided to let her manage his career, as even his band members were placing bets on her length of stay. First things first, choose the ideal song. He Stopped Loving Her Today was a demo that producer Billy Sherrill guarded for months because he thought it may be the song that launched his career. George was all too familiar with tragic love stories like the one in the song. It was about a man whose love for a woman lasted till his death. When he initially heard the demo tape, he yelled out, "Nobody wants to hear a song about a dead man," and threw it across the room. The sessions of recording were exhausting. George lost his bearings due to the effects of the medicines. He tried to sing the spoken-word bridge one last time in his Donald Duck voice, but he failed miserably because he found it too depressing. His motive was pure malice. But Nancy insisted him stay in the studio every day until he got it just right. They used his rendition of the final verse from one session in which he sobbed. It took over a year to capture the 3 most memorable minutes in country music's history. It took a plethora of arrangers, 83 takes, and 3 different studios to get the song just right. Nancy never wavered in her conviction that they had captured lightning in a bottle, even though Billy Sherrill came dangerously close to declining twice, and the record label threatened to discontinue funding. When He Stopped Loving Her Today came out in 1980, not even George could have foreseen its commercial catastrophe. "That troubled soul won't be selling," he said Nancy. Not only did the song dominate the charts, but it also became the first ever ACM Song of the Year to win the award consecutively. Rolling Stone magazine said it was the best country song ever. Subtly, Nancy moved in with George, who disposed of his narcotics and booze by flushing them down the toilet. During his withdrawal, she stayed up all night with him, singing him his old songs when the demons were too much to handle. On one particularly horrible night, he tried to jump out of a second-story window. Nancy caught him, and they both grieved on the floor until it was light outside. They fell in love sometime in the midst of their separate sobriety and relapses. In contrast to his formerly passionate love for Tammy, their bond was stronger and more permanent. Even with his flaws, she loved George Jones the man, but she didn't think much of George Jones the legend. The company fell into a tailspin when George began to turn up. He became more punctual, performed sober, and recited every word. Following his return to the Opry, he once again received messages from the same promoters who had banned him. In his first appearance at the Opry while sober, Johnny sang brilliantly for 2 hours. Even Tammy Wynette sent a note that read, "Welcome back, Possum," and a bouquet of flowers on stage. George and Nancy exchanged wedding vows in 1983. She took on the roles of manager and guardian angel in addition to those of his husband. Resolving his financial responsibilities and repairing his reputation, she renegotiated his contracts. As part of her mission to aid him in overcoming his afflictions, she helped him reconcile with his children, and most importantly, rescued his old gold records from pawn shops. Despite the album's popularity, the real story of his comeback was represented by the title track, "I Am," a song about accepting one's heritage without letting it define them. His performance at that year's CMA Awards moved the audience to tears. He had received a standing ovation of 2 minutes prior to his performance. The final judges of his value were his peers. Even rock and rollers like Keith Richards and Elvis Costello couldn't help but notice him at concerts. He had a profound impact on up-and-coming artists like Randy Travis and Alan Jackson. He had transformed from No-Show Jones into the sage of country music. "Reminded us all what country music is supposed to be," said Waylon Jennings of him. "George Jones isn't just back." On that memorable day in 1992, in the East Room of the White House, President George H.W. Bush bestowed the Kennedy Center honors onto George Jones. A national treasure had emerged from the Beaumont neighborhood's young man who had previously performed for drinking money. Nothing more than "not bad for a" came out of his acceptance speech. Willie Nelson quietly whispered to Merle Haggard, "The possum finally made it to the big house without getting arrested." But the real victory wasn't in the praise or the prizes. It was in the serenity he'd found with Nancy at his side. Sobriety remained his guiding principle even when confronted with the final test. Gold records, sold-out shows, and most importantly, he was just showing up. Everything was going swimmingly for him. He began warning the young artists he mentored about the dangers of addiction, even though, as he would joke, they were more interested in hearing the lawnmower narrative. Reuniting with Tammy Wynette in 1995 was a lyrical milestone in country music's history. They eventually put their anger aside and recorded a duet after decades of feuding. Their voices blended beautifully. As the sessions progressed, they were overheard conversing over coffee and sharing fond memories of the past. The trade press labeled it "The Day Hell Froze Over," but George and Tammy just saw it as closure when Tammy brought in a toy lawnmower as a joke. George will be remembered for the influence he had on artists that came after him. In order for Alan Jackson to win his CMA award, George had to accompany him on stage. Garth Brooks did not provide Jones an audience at any of the venues where he had previously been barred. While Travis Tritt would interject stories about George Jones during his performances, rock icons like Keith Richards and Elvis Costello praised him as the top American voice. Jones was even proclaimed King of Broken Hearts by Bob Dylan. Despite sustaining several injuries, including a ruptured liver and lungs, Jones narrowly escaped death in a car accident that occurred in 1999. He had been reaching for his phone to contact Nancy, but he hadn't drank quite as much as was thought. First responders found him singing "He Stopped Loving Her Today" as a method to stay attentive while he was recovering in the hospital. Even more heartwarming than the more than 10,000 get-well cards he received were the words from sober individuals who shared how his rehabilitation gave them hope. As the new century began, new challenges surfaced. In response to a question regarding the dwindling airplay of traditional country music, Jones was candid. "Modern country is just a bunch of kids in cowboy hats peddling pop music to teenagers." Despite the fact that his Grammy-winning single Choices went unplayed by mainstream radio, it became a declaration of artistic integrity. "I don't do rap and I can't yodel" was his famous response to the subject of whether he would change his style to garner more radio play. His 2008 CD Burning Down the House includes duets with Keith Richards and Dolly Parton. As one of the musicians who have spoken about George's influence on their careers, Dolly Parton reminisces about showing up at 3 a.m. to fill the air with a new melody, while describing how, in contrast to his previous use of a lawnmower, as so brilliantly portrayed by Merle Haggard, he now took driving. Singing along to a George Jones record is a great method to learn new songs. George became somewhat of a country music elder as he got older. Many up-and-coming artists would travel to his house to hear his tales and hear his advice. As evidence that he retained his sense of humor regarding his wild youth, he also sold No-Show Jones t-shirts throughout his performances. His opinion on modern country performers lip-syncing was as follows: "Hell, I couldn't even sing in sync with myself half the time." He made his final public appearance at the 2013 Grand Ole Opry. He remained for 3 songs despite being only supposed to sing 1. Finally, he stopped loving her today. As he played the final chord, the audience became quiet, understanding they were witnessing the death of a musical icon. George Jones's untimely passing at the age of 81 was a bolt of lightning that hit Nashville on April 26, 2013. The funeral for him was broadcast live from the Grand Ole Opry House. Last but not least, Alan Jackson sang "He Stopped Loving Her Today" while inconsolable, finishing the show in tears. First Lady Laura Bush addressed his tenure in office in her speech. Along with his gold records and Kennedy Center Medal, the lawnmower now resides in the Country Music Hall of Fame, a symbol that love, music, and assistance can transform even the most tragic stories into triumphs, representing even his former friend Tammy Wynette. Georgette, who sang "If We Could Hear Each Other's Hearts Today," was another representative. Country music will never be the same because of his heartfelt songs, which continue to motivate listeners to follow in his footsteps. During his funeral, Nancy Jones made the comment that George Jones personified the entirety of country music, including its highs and lows, its pain, and its salvation.